Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is FPL Fran, and today's video is going to be the Game Week 8 team selection. Now, as you guys know, if you've watched the previous wildcard draft, I am actually on an activated wildcard chip, so I have obviously pulled the trigger on that. And I was dealing with two options, right? And both options actually included a midfield, including Eze, and now he's injured, so obviously the draft has had to change, but we've also got some additional injury updates during the week, right? We had Estupinian out. We have actually some additional Spurs injuries that make it even more tempting, for example, for Richarlison to be a pick as well. And also Diaby, a little bit of uncertainty there because it doesn't seem like he's been in training, and I don't think he'll be fit for Game Week 8. And if he is fit for Game Week 8, I think also we're going to see very limited minutes, which also probably means that he's not the best wildcard transfer. So in terms of this week, I've actually been able to capture a lot of price rises and falls, and not too much really to talk about in terms of why I'm wildcarding. But obviously the reason is because I wanted to save as much money as possible, avoid all the price falls that were, happening towards my Man United midfielders and even some other picks, and actually invest in, instead of, let's say, the Man United midfielders, into, for example, the Spurs midfielders instead, where they also have equally good fixtures, but I have a lot more confidence in them as a team. And ultimately, we can see, obviously, a lot of team strengths, a lot of projections are expecting United to get worse and worse, Tottenham better and better from our initial expectations from Game Week 1. So from that basis, I have decided to wildcard, and here's going to be the draft. From the goalkeeping position, I'm actually going to go with a pair, but it's not a pair in the sense that I'm rotating goalkeepers. It's just a pair in the sense that I have two keepers. It's Raya and Areola. Now, if you actually look at the Spurs fixtures and the Arsenal fixtures, they don't actually rotate very well at all. And if anything, the only time Areola is going to be like a default starter is probably this week in Game Week 8, and then also in the back half of the sort of opening calendar up until, let's say, Game Week 20, where, let's say, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, those sort of weeks are weeks where I can maybe play Areola instead of Raya. But the idea behind punting on Raya is simply because I actually think there's a little bit of difficulty in actually choosing the right Arsenal defenders on a draft. For example, when we look at players like Zinchenko, and Gabriel, who have been rotated in the past before, particularly when, let's say, Partey is also fit, and he's actually, he has been training. So that obviously means with players like Tomiyasu and Kirior in the squad, that I do think that some Arsenal rotation can actually eventually come. Now, I don't think necessarily we'll see that in the bigger games, but obviously you want to be owning these Arsenal defenders for the easier fixtures after game weeks 10 plus. And if we don't have the confidence that they'll be starting going forwards, I think it sort of throws out maybe Zinchenko and Gabriel on my draft for the time being. I think you can obviously still go for these picks. I'm just a little bit more cautious as a manager, and I just would like to see if there is any rotation at all. And instead, I've decided to sort of back Raya for the time being. There is a risk there, but I think the difference here is that there's always going to be a backup keeper in Areola who has been absolutely standout this season, and he's actually been one of the best shot stoppers. So those are my keepers. As far as my defense, I'm going with Cash, who I don't think really needs to be discussed much. I think he's an absolute lock within the wild card. I've already bagged a price rise with him there. Ultimately, he has the cleanest fixture run of almost all defenders, and he's at a ridiculously cheap price point considering the expected goal involvement he has per game. And there's a lot of confidence, of course, with this Aston Villa team as well. So this is, for example, a great period to actually enter into an Aston Villa asset like a Cash on this fixture here. Dalot is also going to join. He was a transfer last week. I know Dalot is obviously very controversial for most people, but the simple reality is this United team, of course, even though they just conceded 3 versus Galatasaray and look terrible all over the pitch and have injuries, they just have easier fixtures, right? They have fixtures where you'd expect clean sheets, particularly some jammy clean sheets where they, for example, got 2 so far within the season. So I think our expectations of, let's say, a Fernandes and Rashford haul much more diminished than, let's say, United's ability to get a clean sheet here and there. And they do have good home fixtures, but they're also facing some very, very weak teams, particularly from the offensive point of view. So you have some faith in them there. I think, as I said, I have even less faith in the attackers, but a defense and one defender in particular is something I'm okay with, particularly an attacking defender in Dalot, who can also get yourself bonus points. So I will be keeping Dalot, and the simple reality is you've got Luton, Fulham, Sheffield United on the calendar, and even Brentford arguably who've not been the best, but not too many expectations there in that game. As far as Taylor, though, he's just a pure gap-filling option. He's someone who's going to be permanently rotating. Now, Lamptey, of course, is someone that a lot of people have been looking at, and he's actually close to a price rise, but I don't think I'll be going with Lamptey whatsoever. I think the tough thing is that Estupiñán has been rumored out, but the issue, of course, is that he's only been rumored out for 1 month. So the timeline that De Zerbi gave was something like 1 month, give or take. And that simply means that Lamptey will probably only benefit from one good fixture, which is Game Week 10. And then by game week 11 to 12, which are also good fixtures, Estupiñán could already be back in the team, which would already sort of reduce the whole point of going for Lamptey in a wildcard draft. You want to create a robust draft, at least with Taylor. I know for now that he's actually nailed within the team, and he'll probably actually fill in when, let's say, Burnley finally have some easy fixtures once again. So in terms of Colwill and Burn, this is an interesting thing because I think Colwill is a player that's actually needed, for example, for the purpose of game week 8, because as you can see, Burn has a bad fixture with Newcastle away. So this is a good opportunity to actually go for Colwill here, get a start versus Burnley, who have actually honestly been a terrible attacking team. Burnley have actually only been second in terms of expected goals created. So effectively one of the worst attacking teams within the league. And we've also, of course, seen them be a very, very poor defense as well, like in the Spurs game. So Colwill, of course, is a great pick in the sense that you can actually play him on game week 8, but also on game week 10. And why is game week 10 important? Because obviously Dalot has a very bad fixture on that fixture. And right now, of course, I don't have Zinchenko, but I will be looking to maybe invest into him in the future. And then actually, I'll also be going with Dan Burn. Dan Burn also got a price rise just like Colwill, scored versus PSG as well. So obviously massive shout out to him. I will be benching him this week, sadly, but the idea, of course, is to play him on the good Newcastle fixtures where we can once again see very, very high clean sheet probabilities, which, you know, has happened in the previous 2 weeks, but I don't think you're expecting it really versus West Ham away. It's a very, very tough game, so I will be benching him. And Dan Burn, as I said, is a very good pick on game week 9, for example, when he plays Crystal Palace at home and various other fixtures, just because this Newcastle team are such a good defense. And then in terms of the midfield, I'll actually be going with Mbeumo, Salah, Maddison, Son, and Richarlison. So an absolutely action-packed midfield. And as you can see, I've decided to keep Mbeumo. And the reason why I'm keeping Mbeumo is because there's so much, you know, injuries really in place. And unfortunately, I also have a lot of money tied into Mbeumo, which I'm not, for example, you know, keen on, for example, keeping the money, but the reality is there's just no other options to go for if Diaby's not fit for this game week, right? Because I've always said that Mbeumo is almost a Diaby replacement, but effectively, when you look at Mbeumo, I still think that the fixture difficulty is terrible for Brentford, but you still have that Burnley at home fixture. So the way I see it, Mbeumo is a very easy transfer in game week 10. So I just give him, you know, a fixture versus a very, very poor Man United now, and then also a very, very good fixture versus Burnley at home, which is a good opportunity to sort of say goodbye to Mbeumo and then actually revisit, for example, Diaby, who hopefully will be fit by game week 10. Not only that, but as you can see, I'm also going for Richarlison punt. So clearly not going for Spurs defenders at this point in time, but clearly targeting the Spurs team, who actually have 2 fantastic fixtures back to back. And the same concept of going Richarlison sort of exists within why I described why I'm going for Mbeumo and keeping him as well, because ultimately players like Eze hopefully would be back, because the international break means obviously 2 weeks of rest. And we did hear, for example, a rumor that he may be 6 weeks out, but also I've heard rumors saying, you know, as early as 2 to 3 weeks out only. So it really depends, but Eze could be an option by then as well. Not only that, but also we can also keep a little bit of an open mind towards someone like Anthony Gordon, who could be a fantastic pick. In fact, I actually had a lot of consideration for an Anthony Gordon draft, and I'll show you guys a second option draft right after this. But effectively, Richarlison is just a great punt for the next 2 fixtures. Why I say that is because with Richarlison, we know that Manor Solomon is out for 2 to 3 months, and that's actually obviously hugely impactful for those left wing minutes, which means that Richarlison can actually play there. At the same time, we also know that Brennan Johnson is dealing with an injury, and actually the plan for Spurs is for him to sort of be reincorporated within the team and to get back into the squad after the international break. So this gives Richarlison a fantastic opportunity to actually play these 2 fantastic fixtures, Luton away and Fulham at home. Why I'm saying this is fantastic is for Richarlison, even though he's actually going on international break and playing for this Brazilian national team, is because actually if you look at the fixtures for game week 9, Spurs actually play the last within the sort of fixture calendar. They actually play on Monday, so Richarlison actually gets technically 2 additional days of rest compared to his peers within the Premier League and his other South American peers. So he will actually be getting that rest, and I do think I'll be very confident that he starts, because also keep in mind that Brennan Johnson would not have, for example, been match fit prior to that game. So it's very likely that even if Richarlison is to be an early sub in that game, that he's going to play at least maybe 65, 70 minutes, which is more than enough, in my opinion, to be a 2 game week punt. And that's sort of the point with Richarlison. Whereas with Mbeumo, I've always said that he could be a season keeper. Obviously, he's been very dismaying so far, but I also think that maybe our expectations for Mbeumo are too high just because he's had some miraculous hauls lately. But, you know, when you look at, for example, as I said, the recent Nottingham Forest game, you can actually see, of course, he could have even deserved a penalty, which ultimately he's a penalty taker, and a lot of the penalty takers that we have at this price bracket aren't very interesting. Morgan Gibbs-White has just gotten benched. He's also just not really good in terms of underlying stats in open play, and Eze, of course, is injured. So for now, I'm going with the Richarlison punt. And then in the forward position, I've decided to keep Julian Alvarez. Maybe a little bit of recency bias, of course, watching another fantastic Champions League performance from him. 1 goal, 1 assist as a super sub, effectively. He got his rest, which actually gives me a lot of confidence that he'll play the full game versus Arsenal. Now, the question, of course, is as a South American player, as I said once again, particularly with, let's say, Messi also being injured, he's probably going to play a lot of minutes for this Argentina national team. And actually, for the Brighton home fixture, it might be the case that he doesn't get to play, the full game. But last international break, we actually saw him come back, and he actually came back from Bolivia, for example, with high altitude, and actually came back and actually played effectively the full game. So his fitness levels, I don't think, can be questioned. He's gotten his rest. Even in the midweek cup games, for example, in the EFL Cup, you can see that he was also hooked off early, whereas in the Premier League, of course, unless Rodri decides to strangle someone by the throat, Julian Alvarez will usually play 90 minutes as well, which is, of course, a huge plus. So I really like Alvarez for the time being. Yes, of course, the competing option is Watkins, but I really think that Watkins does sort of hamper the draft quite a bit in terms of the inflexibility of it. I know Watkins has clearly 3 better fixtures when you look at, let's say, 8, 9, and 10 in combination, but actually also factoring that Alvarez will also have Bournemouth at home, and by game week 12, let's say, you might even want to move back into Alvarez. I have a lot of money tied into Alvarez. I have him at 6.8 compared to the rest of the field, which would be owning him at 6.9 or 7.0. So there's a cost saving here that I really, really want to keep. And ultimately, I do think Alvarez is still a quality player to be a season keeper. Now, in terms of Haaland, obviously, I mean, it could actually be debatable for some people, because I did mention that Haaland was a genuine possibility for me. I have been able to find options now thanks to Richarlison sort of coming fit. I've also, as I said, considered both Gordon and Neto in the past, but I think with Gordon it's obviously tough because you sort of have to navigate around his suspension, which also means that you're sort of hampering your Game Week 8 squad, which is why I've decided to sort of ignore Gordon for the time being, even though I really, really like Gordon as a pick, and I'll talk about that in a second. But obviously this is option A, and I think this is actually the option that I'm going with. So I'll quickly talk about option B now. Option B now is actually just changing 2 players. It's actually changing Taylor out and also changing Richarlison out. Richarlison would be replaced by Anthony Gordon, and then Taylor would be replaced by Pedro Porro. Now, the idea behind this draft obviously is with 5 sort of rotating defenders. Instead of having Taylor now, I'm sort of relying upon someone like Pedro Porro, who will be playing these 2 next fixtures, and then actually probably transferred out for an Arsenal defender. And then someone in Richarlison's position is just going to be replaced by Gordon. And the idea, obviously, within this draft structure here is that since I have Colwill, I can actually just play, Colwill, Dalot, Cash, and Pedro Porro in this structure. But I'm not that interested in option B, unfortunately, just because I think that there's such a good punt here to be made with Richarlison, and there's so many transfers out, hopefully by game week 10, in that price point where I don't have to be worried about owning Richarlison for the long term. Whereas you can even argue that Maddison and Son, at the sort of price points that they are, and particularly if Son's on penalties, are quite easy to keep as well, particularly given that we also have a lot of confidence in the Spurs and their attack, and honestly growing confidence week to week. So that's option B. But in terms of my team selection, assuming that I actually play option A, which is obviously the Richarlison draft, I will be lining up with Areola as my keeper. It's actually a very tough choice because I think both keepers have really bad fixtures. It might just be a question of who's going to make more saves between Areola and Raya, because I really am not expecting clean sheets whatsoever, even though both keepers are at home. I think I might actually go with Areola just because I have more confidence in City's attack to score. So in that situation, I'd probably go with Areola, who's also capable of making more saves, and he probably will have to make more saves given that this Newcastle team are creating a lot of shot creating opportunities each week. I'm just hoping that, for example, City will be quite clinical and Arsenal will sort of reduce the amount of shots, which means less save opportunities for Raya. As far as the defense this week, obviously I will be playing with Cash. He's just someone that you can play pretty much for every fixture going forwards. Dalot as well, and then Colwill, as I mentioned, just because Taylor, not going to play him this week, and then Dan Burn, unfortunately, just has a bad fixture himself as well. So I will be also going in the midfield with just the full midfield setup, going with the triple Spurs, going with Salah and Mbeumo as well, and then in the forward position, Alvarez and Haaland. So that means that my bench will be comprised of Archer, who will be first on bench just because he's Fulham away, and then Burnley second on bench, and then third on bench is going to be Taylor. As far as captaincy this week, I actually think it's quite an interesting sort of topic, right? Ultimately, I think that as long as we get the go-ahead from Angie that Son is fit and ready to play, we haven't actually had any sort of news about Son's injury or him re-aggravating it. So I think he's actually, good to go. And hopefully with at least 80 minutes out or 75 minutes out, that's good enough for Son to be a captaincy option, assuming that he's also, the penalty taker, as I've said for a few weeks now. So Son going to be my captaincy option, assuming that Angie says he's fit to play. And if, let's say, Son's not fit to play, I'll probably have to change my captaincy around, at which point, obviously, I would thoroughly consider a captaincy between actually Richarlison and Maddison and Salah. So obviously Haaland for me is just not a captaincy option this week. I have too many options that I think have better fixtures. This is probably Haaland's worst fixture of the season. It is the second best defense or even third best defense if you consider Newcastle to be above Arsenal in this fixture. And obviously it's an away fixture, which obviously makes it even worse for City. So in this context, I think this is great to go for Salah, who obviously will be facing up versus, honestly, a bottom half defense in Brighton, right, away from home. And the same sort of situation obviously lies within Maddison. So for example, if Son's out, Maddison's probably going to be on penalty duty. So Maddison has a really good captaincy shout opportunity there. I would probably lean with Maddison, but also Salah becomes a very interesting differential because his ownership is much lower too. So he could be quite the punt and quite the sort of free risk punt as well. So this is going to be my captaincy for game week 8, and obviously my team selection, which is comprised of a wild card draft as well. Tell me what you guys think. Do you guys like option 1 or do you like option 2? Option 2 obviously includes, for example, benching Gordon for 1 week, but then actually getting him and capitalizing him on the sort of remaining fixtures. And let me know what you guys are thinking in terms of transfers and things like that. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys can smash the like button, that would be absolutely lovely. Still trying to hit that target of 400 likes, so let's actually go for that on this video. And I hope you guys have a wonderful week filled with green arrows. So take care, and I'll see you guys very shortly.